The rain hammered the cafe's windows, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out the world beyond. Inside, the air smelled of roasted coffee and damp wool, and an old man sat alone, his gnarled hands cradling a cup that held no name. He stared at it, eyes tracing the steam as if it carried a secret he'd forgotten long ago. Elliot Grayson, 82 years old, was a fixture at the copper kettle, as much a part of the place as the chipped mugs or the creaky wooden floor. Every morning, he shuffled in, his coat too big for his shrinking frame, and ordered a black coffee. But today was different. Today, he leaned forward, his voice a gravelly whisper, and said to the barista, "Write Clara on the cup." The young woman behind the counter, Lily, paused, marker hovering. She'd never written a name for him before. His request hung in the air, heavy with a story she didn't know. Elliot's eyes, clouded with age, flickered with something sharp grief, perhaps, or hope. He didn't explain, and Lily didn't ask. She scribbled Clara in her looping script, handed him the cup, and watched him return to his corner table by the window. The cafe hummed around him, students typing furiously on laptops, a mother soothing a fussy toddler, the espresso machine hissing like an impatient cat. But Elliot was an island, untouched by the chaos, lost in the name on his cup. He hadn't spoken Clara's name in decades. Not since the war, not since the letters stopped coming. Clara had been his compass, his reason to survive the mud and blood of 1944. They'd met in a village in France, where she was a nurse with a laugh that could cut through the sound of distant bombs. She'd patched up his arm after a shrapnel wound, her hands steady but her eyes warm, promising a future they both believed in. They wrote to each other for 2 years letters filled with dreams of a little house, a garden, maybe a dog. But then her letters stopped. No explanation, no goodbye, just silence. Elliot had come home to a world that felt emptier without her. He'd built a life married, raised a daughter, buried a wife, but Clara remained a ghost in his heart, a question mark that never faded. Now, at the end of his days, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, somewhere, waiting for him to find her. The cafe door jingled, pulling him from his thoughts. A woman entered, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, her face lined with the kind of beauty that time refines rather than erases. She carried a book under her arm, its cover worn from years of reading. Elliot's breath caught. Something about her, the way she tilted her head, the curve of her smile felt like a memory he couldn't place. She ordered a tea and sat 2 tables away, opening her book with a quiet grace. Lily, wiping down the counter, noticed Elliot staring. "You know her?" she asked, her voice low. Elliot shook his head, but his eyes didn't move. "No, just reminds me of someone." The morning stretched on, and Elliot sipped his coffee, the name Clara staring back at him. He wondered why he'd asked for it today. Maybe it was the rain, stirring up old wounds. Maybe it was the ache in his bones, reminding him time was running out. Or maybe it was something else, a pull, a whisper from the past, urging him to remember. He glanced at the woman again. She was reading, her lips moving slightly, almost as if she were whispering the words to herself. Elliot's heart thudded, an unfamiliar rhythm for a man who thought he'd felt everything life had to offer. He wanted to speak to her, to ask her name, but fear held him back. What if she was just a stranger? What if she was Clara, and she didn't remember him? The cafe grew quieter as the lunch crowd thinned. Lily, sensing the weight of the moment, approached Elliot's table. "You okay, Mr. Grayson?" she asked, her voice soft. He nodded, but his fingers tightened around the cup. "Just thinking about someone I lost a long time ago." Lily hesitated, then said, "You know, sometimes people come back. Maybe not the way you expect, but life's funny like that." Elliot managed a small smile. "You're too young to know how funny life can be, Lily." She laughed, but her eyes were kind. "Maybe, but I see a lot in this place. People find each other here, sometimes." Elliot looked back at the woman, who was now writing something in the margins of her book. His heart urged him to stand, to cross the room, to say something, anything. But his legs felt heavy, anchored by years of regret and what-ifs. Then, the woman looked up. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the world stopped. There was no recognition in her gaze, but there was curiosity, a spark that made Elliot's chest ache with possibility. She smiled faintly, then returned to her book. Elliot exhaled, his hands trembling. He didn't know her name, But he knew he couldn't let this moment slip away. Not again. He stood, slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. The cafe seemed to hold its breath as he took a step toward her table, the cup with Clara, written on it, still clutched in his hand. Elliot's steps were slow, deliberate, each one a battle against the weight of 70 years. The woman looked up again as he approached, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in the way one studies a painting they can't quite place. He stopped at her table, the coffee cup trembling in his hand, the name Clara, a quiet accusation against the silence of decades. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Do you mind if I sit?" She tilted her head, her smile cautious but warm. "Not at all," she said, gesturing to the empty chair. Her voice was soft, with a faint accent Elliot couldn't place. British, maybe, softened by years elsewhere. He sat, setting the cup on the table, the name facing her like a question. "I'm Elliot," he said, his heart pounding as if he were 20 again, standing on a battlefield with a letter from Clara in his pocket. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all," she replied, closing her book. "I'm Margaret." She glanced at the cup, her brow furrowing slightly. "Clara," she read aloud, her voice curious. "A friend of yours?" Elliot's throat tightened. "Someone I knew a long time ago, during the war." Margaret nodded, her eyes softening. "The war took a lot from all of us, didn't it?" He wanted to ask her everything: where she was from, what she'd seen, if she'd ever known a nurse named Clara in a French village in 1944. But the words felt too heavy, too raw. Instead, he said, "You remind me of her. The way you carry yourself." Margaret's smile deepened, but there was a flicker of something sadness, perhaps in her eyes. "That's kind of you to say. I'm just an old woman who likes her tea and her books." They talked, haltingly at first, about small things. The rain, the cafe, the book she was reading, a collection of poetry by Rilke. But as minutes turned to an hour, the conversation grew deeper. Margaret spoke of her childhood in London, of surviving the Blitz, of moving to America after the war to start over. Elliot shared fragments of his own life, his years as a teacher, his daughter who lived across the country, the wife he'd lost to cancer a decade ago. He didn't mention Clara again, but her name sat between them, written boldly on the cup. Then came the twist, a moment that shifted the air in the cafe. The door jingled, and a man entered, his face weathered but kind, his hair a mix of gray and black. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on Margaret. "Maggie," he called, his voice warm with familiarity. "I've been looking for you." Margaret's face lit up. "Tom," she said, standing to embrace him. Elliot's heart sank, a quiet ache spreading through him. Tom was her husband, he assumed, or a partner, someone who belonged in her life in a way he never could. But as Tom approached, he extended a hand to Elliot. "You must be one of Maggie's cafe friends," he said, his grin wide. "I'm her brother. She's always dragging me to this place." Brother. The word hit Elliot like a lifeline. He shook Tom's hand, his mind racing. Margaret wasn't Clara, she couldn't be, not with a brother named Tom and a life in London during the war. But the relief of knowing she wasn't tied to someone else was overshadowed by a deeper realization. He was chasing a ghost, and Margaret, real and alive in front of him, was not that ghost. Tom joined them, pulling up a chair. He was a talker, filling the space with stories of their childhood, of Margaret's stubborn streak, of how she'd once snuck into a restricted library to read forbidden books. Elliot listened, laughing at the right moments, but his eyes kept drifting to the cup. Clara. The name felt heavier now, a reminder of what he'd lost and what he was still searching for. As the afternoon waned, Margaret excused herself to the restroom. Tom leaned forward, his voice low. "You know, she doesn't talk about the war much. It changed her. She lost someone important back then." Elliot's heart skipped. "Who?" Tom shrugged, his eyes distant. "She never told me his name. Just said he was a soldier she met in France. She was a nurse, you know. Saved a lot of lives, but she couldn't save him." The words landed like a punch. Elliot's hands trembled, and he hid them under the table. Could it be? Could Margaret be Clara, hiding behind a different name, a different life? He wanted to ask, to demand answers, but fear stopped him. What if he was wrong? What if this was just another cruel trick of memory? Margaret returned, and the conversation shifted to lighter things. But Elliot couldn't shake Tom's words. As they parted ways, Margaret touched his arm. Come back tomorrow, Elliot, she said. I'd like to hear more of your stories. He nodded, his voice caught in his throat. I will. As he left the cafe, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective. He clutched the cup, the ink of Clara smudged but still legible. He didn't know if Margaret was Clara, but for the first time in years, he felt alive with possibility. Elliot barely slept that night. His dreams were a tangle of war and laughter, of Clara's face fading into Margaret's, of letters burning in a fire he couldn't reach. By morning, he was exhausted but determined, his coat buttoned against the chill as he made his way back to the copper kettle. The cafe was quieter today, the rain replaced by a weak sun that barely warmed the city. Lily greeted him with a smile, already reaching for a cup. Clara again? She asked, her tone teasing but kind. Elliot nodded, his voice steady. Clara. He took his usual seat, his eyes scanning the room for Margaret. She wasn't there, and the absence felt like a weight on his chest. He sipped his coffee, the name on the cup a quiet prayer. Minutes turned to an hour, and still, she didn't come. Doubt crept in, whispering that he'd imagined the connection, that Margaret was just a kind stranger, not the woman he'd loved and lost. Then the door opened, and there she was, her silver hair catching the light, her book tucked under her arm. She saw him and smiled, crossing the room with a grace that made his heart ache. You're back, she said, sitting across from him. I was hoping you would be. They fell into conversation easily, as if they'd known each other for years. Margaret spoke of her love for poetry, of how Rilke's words had carried her through dark times. Elliot shared stories of his teaching days, of students who'd made him laugh and cry. But the question of Clara hung between them, unspoken, a thread waiting to be pulled. Then came the twist, a small, unexpected moment that shifted everything. Lily, clearing a nearby table, dropped a tray of mugs. The crash startled the cafe, and Margaret instinctively reached out, steadying a wobbling cup on their table. Her sleeve pulled back, revealing a faded tattoo on her wrist, a tiny dove, its wings outstretched. Elliot's breath caught. He knew that tattoo. Clara had gotten it in France, a quiet rebellion against the war's brutality. She'd shown it to him one night, her laughter soft as she traced it with her finger. Margaret, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Where did you get that tattoo? She froze, her hand pulling back as if burned. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was fear in them. It's just something from a long time ago, she said, her voice tight. France, he pressed, his heart pounding. During the war? She looked away, her fingers twisting the edge of her book. Yes, she admitted. I was a nurse. I don't like to talk about it. Elliot's mind raced. It couldn't be coincidence, not the tattoo, not the way she moved, not the way her presence felt like coming home. But why didn't she recognize him? Why had she stopped writing? He wanted to ask, to spill every question he'd carried for decades, but her expression stopped him. She looked fragile, as if one wrong word might shatter her. Instead, he said, I was in France too. A soldier. I knew a nurse named Clara. She had a tattoo like yours. Margaret's eyes widened, but she didn't speak. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, she said, Clara was a common name back then. A lot of nurses, we all wanted to be someone else, sometimes. Elliot nodded, but his heart screamed that she was lying, or hiding, or protecting something he couldn't understand. He wanted to reach for her hand, to tell her he'd never stopped loving her, but fear held him back. What if she wasn't Clara? What if she was, and she'd chosen to forget him? The cafe filled with new customers, their chatter a stark contrast to the tension at their table. Margaret stood, her movements abrupt. I should go, she said, her voice shaky. I'll see you tomorrow, Elliot. He watched her leave. The dove tattoo burned into his memory. He didn't know what to believe, but he knew he couldn't let her slip away again. He turned to Lily, who'd been watching from the counter. She's hiding something, he said, more to himself than to her. Lily leaned forward, her eyes sharp. Maybe she's not hiding. Maybe she's just scared. Elliot looked at the cup, the name Clara staring back at him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he'd be back, searching for answers, searching for her. Elliot arrived at the copper kettle earlier than usual, the morning light casting long shadows across the empty tables. He felt like a soldier again, waiting for a battle he didn't understand but couldn't avoid. The cup in his hand read, Clara, as it had for 3 days now. But today it felt like a key, not a question. Margaret arrived an hour later, her face pale but resolute. She sat across from him without a word, her book unopened on the table. The silence between them was a living thing, heavy with the weight of yesterday's revelation. Elliot wanted to speak, to demand answers, but he waited, sensing she needed to set the pace. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "You asked about my tattoo yesterday. About Clara." Elliot nodded, his heart in his throat. "I need to know, Margaret. Are you her?" She looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. "I was Clara," she said, the words barely audible. "A long time ago. I left that name behind after the war." The confession hit Elliot like a wave, washing away decades of doubt. He leaned forward, his voice trembling. "Why? Why did you stop writing? I thought you were dead." Tears welled in her eyes, and she wiped them away with a shaky hand. "I thought you were dead, Elliot. I got a letter from your unit, saying you'd been killed in action. It broke me. I couldn't stay Clara after that. I became Margaret, moved to America, tried to start over." Elliot's mind reeled. A letter. A mistake. A lie that had stolen their future. "I never stopped looking for you," he said, his voice breaking. "I wrote to you for months. I went to the village, but you were gone." Margaret clariached for his hand, her touch warm and real. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I thought I'd lost you forever." They sat there, hands clasped, the years falling away. The cafe faded, and it was just them, two young lovers in a French village, dreaming of a life that had been stolen. But the joy of finding each other was tempered by the pain of what they'd lost: decades of love, of laughter, of the little house they'd planned. Then came the final twist, a quiet moment that redefined everything. Lily, who'd been listening from the counter, approached with a small box. "Mr. Grayson, this came for you yesterday," she said, her voice soft. "It was in the lost and found, but it's addressed to you." Elliot opened the box, his hands trembling. Inside was a bundle of letters, yellowed and fragile, tied with a faded ribbon. His name was written on the envelope in Clara's unmistakable handwriting. "These are yours," he said, handing them to her. Clara's hands shook as she untied the ribbon. The letters were hers, written after she'd thought he was dead, poured out in grief and love she'd never sent. Ascending the bundle, she found a letter from Elliot, written before the misinformation about his death. "My love," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, but know that I loved you with every breath." They cried together, the cafe silent around them, as they read the words they'd never shared. The letters were a bridge across time, a testament to a love that had survived despite everything. They held each other, their tears mingling, their hearts full. "I never stopped loving you," Elliot said, his voice steady now. "And I never stopped loving you," Clara replied. They didn't know what the future held, but they had this moment, this cafe, this cup with her name. It was enough.